Good morning to our ABNY members. We hope you all had a safe, healthy, and joyful holiday season and Happy New Year. I'm Laura Colacurcio, the Vice President here at ABNY. I bring you greetings today from our Chairman, Stephen Rubenstein, who is not able to join us, and from our Chief Executive Officer, Melva Miller, who is taking a well-deserved vacation in the Maldives. I'm jealous. Wow. Welcome to our first event of 2022. Thank you for joining us for this virtual members-only special briefing. Though we're online today, we are eager to see you in person soon, and hopefully within the next several weeks as the city turns the corner on Omicron. As we kick off programming for 2022, we'll continue to focus on bringing you relevant and timely information about the policies and projects driving the city and state forward. Today, we are here to learn more about the Penn Station area civic and land use improvement project. Though in the news long before Governor Kathy Hochul raised the issue in her State of the State address just last week, the renewed focus on this massive complex warrants our attention. Melva and I were grateful to receive a tour of the proposed improvements to the Penn District back in June. And since then, the team at ESD has received feedback from the Community Advisory Committee Working Group. Now, the team at ESD has proposed revisions to the general project plan in response. Because the effort to reconstruct and revitalize Penn Station reaches a wide constituency with many opinions, and because this project has the potential to transform a critical piece of our city, we are convening the experts here today to provide you with the facts about the GPP and its potential impact. Today, we'll hear from Holly Leicht, Executive Vice President of Real Estate Development and Planning at ESD. Holly actually recently joined our ABNY Young Professionals for a boardroom breakfast where she discussed her role at ESD and her involvement in projects such as the Moynihan Train Hall and the High Line Connector. She previously led HUD's New York and New Jersey relief efforts after Superstorm Sandy and has held positions at New Yorkers for Parks, HPD, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, and the Municipal Art Society. She'll be joined by her colleague, Phil Maguire, Vice President of Design and Construction at ESD. Phil spent time in the private sector before joining the public sector, including time at Arc House Partners, Thor Equities, and Atco Properties and Management. We'll also hear from Barry Langer, Executive Vice President, Development, and Co-Head of Real Estate at Vornado Realty Trust. Barry oversees Vornado's efforts to transform the Penn District neighborhood, where it is the largest owner of commercial real estate with 10 million square feet. He previously spent time at Boston Properties, where he focused on the development of Times Square Tower and 5 Times Square. Now, the panel here will address questions at the end of this presentation. Please feel welcome to submit questions throughout using the chat function or the raise hand function when we come to the Q&A portion. Audience members asking questions will be invited to unmute and ask their question live. And so, as a commuter who travels through Penn Station regularly, and as a worker who spent more than 10 years in the Penn Plaza district, I am eager to hear what these experts have to say about the future of the area. So thank you to Holly, Phil, and Barry for being with us today. And Holly, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Laura. And I am also joined by my ESD colleagues, in addition to Phil, Gabriella Green, Marion Phillips, and Angel Santana. So part of our small but mighty team working in the real estate group here at ESD. And thank you all for joining. It's nice to see Mark Ricks, with whom I first started working on this project when I first came to ESD 4.5 years ago. So we're just going to run through some slides. I will do an overview of the general project plan, and then Barry is going to dive a little bit into some of the work Vornado has already doing in the area, as well as plans for the future, and then we'll leave some time for questions. So Angel, if you can pop up the slides. Great, first slide, please. Okay, so we're starting from a few, I hope, premises that we can all agree on. We came to this project really at the behest of the MTA that has been focused on overhauling Penn Station for many years. And when I first started, Jano Lieber, at that time running the Capital Group there, came and said, this is a project we have to do together and marry both the improvements to the station with improvements to the neighborhood surrounding it, and to create a source of funding for the overhaul of the station. And since then, we've also, as many know, added the expansion of Penn Station to the scope of what the MTA and the railroads are looking at. And why does this have to happen? Well, existing Penn Station was built to accommodate about 300,000 commuters. In 2019, it was double that. And even with the COVID effect, the railroads still anticipate that by 2038, it will almost be another tripled of the original, so almost 900,000 commuters daily. And as you can see, and as we all know, this is really it is the biggest transportation hub in the western hemisphere, and has all of these subway stations as well as Amtrak and the PATH station coming through it. And Barry will talk a little bit more about the transportation work that he's done. Next. And so in terms of payment, the second premise is that we know this is going to be a massively expensive undertaking, one that is way more than we think that we can expect a budget allocation to cover. So roughly, and it's hard to pin the railroads down to a cost, but I have gotten them to agree that the cost of doing the projects that would be the gateway, the Hudson Tunnel piece of gateway, the expansion, and the renovation of existing Penn is somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 to $40 billion. Now, as most people know, there was an agreement made in the Obama administration among the feds, New Jersey and New York, to divide the cost of gateway so that the feds would pay 50% and each state would do another 25%. We are anticipating that that split probably applies to all of them. Those negotiations are still underway, but would apply to the rest of the project, in which case New York State's share would be 7.5 to 10 billion. So that's really the number that we're solving for when we look at the GPP project. Next. And of course, beyond just paying for Penn, it's also the right place for New York to grow. As we have seen at Grand Central with the East Midtown rezoning, which was focused on growth around one transportation hub, the Penn Station area has really been antiquated for years. The last major building was built in the 70s. We all know that this is a pretty underbuilt area, and yet it is next to our major transportation hub. And so this is really where sustainable growth for the future of New York should be happening. Next slide. So these are the goals that we've gone into the project first. As I mentioned, to help fund the reconstruction and expansion of Penn, and then also to support that expansion with integrated transit and public improvements that are in the GPP, not just what MTA and the railroads are doing. And I'll talk a little bit more about those improvements. To catalyze transit-oriented mixed-use growth, as I mentioned, and really to foster the long-term economic growth of the city, because we do believe it is going to continue to grow, COVID notwithstanding. Next slide. So many people aren't as familiar with general project plans as with the city's ULURP process, but this is the process that ESD uses for all of the projects that we do around the city and many around the state. This is an example of other projects that you're familiar with, I'm sure, that have been done through the general project plan process. What a GPP does is really just lay out program and goals and financial terms, and often it will override local zoning, which is the case here. So it basically creates enforceable design guidelines, which Phil is responsible for creating, and they are in lieu of local zoning. It must undergo environmental review pursuant to SECRA, so we are doing a full environmental impact statement for this project. Slide. So this is the project area outlined in the dashed line. There are 8 development sites that we are focused on in the general project plan. And while Madison Square Garden and existing Penn and Moynihan are all within the project area, we do not have actions planned through this for those sites. There's no anticipated actions on those sites, just the yellow sites. So the 5 northeastern sites, 4 through 8 on here, are owned all or almost all by Vornado, and Barry will talk a little bit more about those. And then the 3 southern sites are the sites that are anticipated and being studied for the expansion of Penn Station. The railroads are going to do an alternatives analysis for a few different locations, but these sites are the most likely from the engineering analysis they've done so far. However, it's important to note that those sites are only contingent upon that being chosen as the location for the expansion. If through their NEPA process, which they will start later this year to do a federal environmental review, if through that process it's determined that sites 1 through 3 are not where they will do the expansion, then those will fall out of GPP for future redevelopment. Those would only be acquired and redeveloped if that is chosen as the location for the southern expansion. So those sites are a little different. Ultimately, if it does go forward, they would be purchased because the expansion would require actually demolition and cover and cut because of how shallow the tracks are at Penn. So those would have to be acquired, relocation for all residents and tenants, and then they would be demolished and redeveloped. But again, only if it's selected through the NEPA process that will follow our process. Next slide. So as you may know, when Governor Hochul came into office, she did a reset and wanted to really reassess the plan, take a look again at it, and we worked closely with her office, as well as the community advisory working group that Laura mentioned, to do revisions to the plan over the course of this summer, and then with Governor Hochul when she came in the fall. So the 2 major tenets that she brought forward is that she agreed with the premise that New Yorkers deserve a great Penn Station, and also that the community deserves a great neighborhood. And so she really embraced the recommendations that were made by the community working group through our process over the summer. Next slide. We did 18 community advisory meetings. We did a particularly intensive period starting in, I guess it was the end of April. We did a 2-hour session every week for 12 weeks with a community working group of about 70 people, going through all the details of both our plan as well as some of the MTA and railroads work. So, and then that resulted at the end of the summer in a set of recommendations that did lead to significant revisions in the plan. I'm getting a little feedback if someone could go on mute. And then we had 8 public meetings and town halls to date. We've also, on top of that, we had a public hearing December 8th, and we have a second public hearing next week on January 20th. Next slide. And here are some of the changes that we've made in the plan since that process. First of all, we reduced the density by 1.4 million square feet, which is about the equivalent of a single super tall building. We are focusing more on mixed use, including residential. The plan will allow for up to 1,800 residential units, including 540 that would be permanently affordable. There's about 8 acres of public space that would be added, and we will create and launch a public realm task force that's somewhat modeled on the one that was created in the East Midtown rezoning, and they will develop a public realm plan. We're increasing public transit access with significant new entrances in all the buildings. More space for community and innovative social services will be requiring community social services on the public sites to the south. Up to 50,000 good paying construction jobs, and we're putting in green transit-oriented commercial growth, some sustainable requirements that will be in the design guidelines. Next slide. So just to go through some of the changes, this was the original plan. It was essentially 100% commercial. The 2 orange were hotel alternatives. Next slide. And this is proposed revision. There's 2 alternatives with a commercial alternative and a residential alternative. But you can see that the density has come down on almost every building. We are now requiring that smaller building on the far lower left to be residential. So that will be a required 542 unit building with 162 permanently affordable units. I should note that the number of tenants that would be displaced if those southern blocks are acquired is fewer than 150 households. So we're giving a right to return to that building to any income qualifying tenants of the other buildings. So even if every single household met the income eligibility, they would be able to relocate into that building. Next slide. And this is the residential alternative. So you can see the one that I mentioned is required. The other three sites here that have the red have a residential alternative, so they could be developed as residential or commercial. Next slide. And here we're just showing kind of how this fits into the context of the rest of the central business district in Midtown. As you know, there's been rezonings both of the Hudson Yards area and East Midtown. We look to both of those for the context of this. This is the original density, and it was maxed out at sort of at the same maximums that East Midtown and Hudson Yards maxed out at. Next slide. But you can see we've taken the density down now, but still, you know, will fit in nicely and kind of fill in that donut hole of Midtown. We work closely with city planning and developing the densities. As you may know, I actually learned in this, which I didn't know before, but city planning does not do height limits in central business districts. They like to not have height limits and just have density limits, so that to encourage more diversity in the skyline. So there are not height limits here. And as you can see, the density now has come down a little bit below Hudson Yards and East Midtown. Next slide. And there's the residential alternative. Slide. The open space we mentioned, this includes required open space ratios for every site, which again, we were inspired to do that by the East Midtown rezoning. And then we have this significant 30,000 square foot public plaza that would be on block 780, which is the block just south of Penn Station. That right now is a super block. This would divide that block and have a very gracious public space in between that would connect into the mid-block train station that the MTA is looking at developing at Penn. This is about the size of Rockefeller Plaza, so a pretty significant size space. Next slide. And this goes to the ratios, the percentage required of open space. This was the original plan, what the percentage was. Next slide. And now we've upped that amount on each site using the ratios that East Midtown used for its site-by-site open space requirements. We also, shared streets have been a big part of this plan from the outset. You can see here that 33rd Street is planned to be a shared street all the way from 6th Avenue to 9th Avenue. This has been a focus of city DOT and city planning for a while to make that a greener street, and also 32nd Street between 6th Avenue and 7th. We've added in the revised plan another option, which is from 7th Avenue to 8th Avenue on 31st Street, which would really connect nicely that plaza with Penn and MSG and the mid-block train hall. So that additional shared street would also add more open space and pedestrian activity. Next slide. So this is just to give you a view. This is 31st Street, where we just talked about adding and that's looking westward toward Moynihan. Next slide. With a combination of the shared street and widened sidewalks, and there's widened sidewalks required throughout the district, you're really getting a much more pedestrian-friendly area, as you can see. This would not exclude, shared streets do not exclude having drop-offs. We understand that drop-offs are important around Penn Station, but it does greatly reduce how much car traffic goes through. The speeds go down to 5 miles an hour. And the experiments that DOT has been doing with shared streets definitely show that people really only tend to use them when they really need to for drop-offs, but not as just a regular source of traffic flow. Fun. Oh, and I should note also the reduction in parking. We're reducing the parking in this district by 68%. really trying to reduce vehicular use and promote more bicycle and pedestrian use. So here's that long shared street I mentioned on 33rd Street. This is looking eastward from the new Manhattan West development. Next slide. And this really becomes a very pedestrianized area. As you know, and Barry will probably talk about it, they actually are pedestrianizing 33rd Street right by MSG. So that will be closed to traffic. We think that will help eliminate some of the traffic even on the rest of it where there's a shared street. But this becomes a really green pedestrian network for 3 full blocks from 6th to 9th. And then as this shows, we are increasing required bike parking by 87%. All the buildings will have required inside bike parking, and we're also looking to increase both the bike parking for people to leave around Penn Station if they want to bring bikes in to commute from Penn Station. Next slide. And one of the things we heard from the community was the importance of preserving some of the iconic views of the Empire State Building, particularly for navigation. So because 33rd Street corridor is going to become such an important pedestrianized corridor, we really focused on that. We worked hard with Vornado to ensure that we could preserve the views of the Empire State Building here. So this is the draft GPP. This is looking from when you come out of the train station at 8th Avenue, the subway right by Moynihan. Next slide. We cut back some of the buildability there, as you can see. And next slide. So you get the whole spire. So basically our benchmark was that we wanted sky on both sides of the spire. So Vornado worked with their architects to ensure that they could have setbacks that would preserve that view. Next slide. And here you are at the mid-block entrance on 33rd at Moynihan. This is the old plan. Next slide. Next slide. With the setback, you get that sky, so you get the whole spire. Next slide. The transit improvements, these are really significant, and we worked very closely with the MTA on these. All of the subway stations, the 4 subway stations, will have significant upgrades and new connections. This is what the underground transit situation looks like now. Next slide. So with our plan under the GPP, you would get 8 new in-building Penn entrances and 10 subway entrances. This will take the subway entrances off the already crowded sidewalks and put them into buildings. They would be very significant, double height, highly visible entrances and help clear. We're widening the sidewalks, but we're also trying to take the clutter off the sidewalks. We're also doing these upgrades in the stations themselves, 8 new escalators, 2 new elevators, and widened staircases in the 4 subway stations. And then significantly adding a below-grade pedestrian concourse. What we're showing here in orange is a way to connect all the way below ground from Penn Station to the Herald Square Station. This is a reopened and expanded Gimbel's Passage that would take people all the way over there. And then ultimately, when the expansion happens, if it happens to the south, you'd have further networks that go under 7th Avenue and take people all the way up to 34th Street. The focus over here, 70% of commuters to Penn go to the northeast toward Eastern Midtown. So we're really focusing on how to get people as effectively as possible over to the northeast, both by widened sidewalks and a better at-grade pedestrian realm, but also below grade for increased efficiency. Next slide. And this just gives a few examples. This is what it looks like now at 34th and 7th. You can barely find the entrance. It's not even on the corner there. The LIR entrance is tucked in there. Next slide. Requirements in the design guidelines for a new building would require that Penn Station entrance is double height and is moved to the corner, so really visible. And so part of what we're trying to do is more the Grand Central model, which is having more entrances that are decentralized. Part of the problem at Penn is you don't have a lot of entrances, so you have a lot of pinch points. And so by having many, many more entrances, you're distributing the commuters much more broadly, which enables just a better pedestrian flow throughout the district. Next slide. Here's another example. Next slide, you see the subway entrance there. And this is 8th and 33rd. You can see that there will be a new, much more visible, much more attractive, desirable entrance there. Next slide. A quick moment on the financing. We will be entering pilot agreements. There are no financial agreements at this point. We are waiting until the plan is set before we negotiate those. So there is no deal yet on this, but the plan is to have pilot agreements on all of the new developments. In addition to some appropriations, there has been $1.3 billion appropriated to the MTA for the transit pieces. All of the funds, whether the appropriations or development related, while the development related revenues would flow through ESC as the property owner, none of them would stay with us. We have said to the city that we would keep them whole for all of their existing taxes that they make on these sites. And then all of the rest of the funds would go either to the MTA for the transit improvements and for the Penn project, or some portion will go to a public realm fund that will be directed by this public realm task force that I mentioned. So that's where all the money would be flowing from the real estate project. Next slide. And then finally, this is just a quick overview of where we are in this process. It started in January of 2020. We've gone through, we have a draft EIS and draft GPP that were released in February. However, we've now revised that GPP, as I mentioned. So we had a public hearing in December on that. We have another one next week. And then we hope we'll have a comment period that lasts another month after that, till February 22nd. And then we'll go back and revise the GPP and EIS again, and hope in the spring to bring the revised final GPP and final EIS to our board for approval sometime in the spring. So now I'll turn it over to Barry.
Good morning. I am joined by my colleagues, Judy Kessler and Audrey Wilson. So just acknowledging they're with us today as well. Hope all are safe and had a nice holiday season. I'm going to focus on work that's been happening to date within the Penn District before the GPP is approved, things that are actually happening now and over the last several years. Vornado is the largest owner in the Penn District. We started acquiring properties here over 40 years ago as part of the Mendick Company, the predecessor to Vornado in New York. We own approximately 10 million square feet surrounding the Penn Station District. Next slide. We've been working very closely with the MTA, with Amtrak, with the railroads as a whole group, and with the state on a series of projects over the last half dozen years. Starting with Moynihan in 2016, which Governor Cuomo got off the ground, and we delivered in December 21. And we're now working very hard with the MTA on improving the Long Island Railroad Concourse, including the creation of a new entrance at 33rd and 7th, which opened about 12 months ago today. Next slide. The Moynihan Train Hall opened December 31st, 2020. You'd be shocked to know that most people actually still haven't been in there, it seems. So I put this in the presentation because with COVID, I can't presume that everyone has seen this. Next slide. This created a new train hall within the Farley Post Office building, added many new escalators and elevators down to the existing tracks. Next slide. What Holly mentioned in one of her early slides, but most people don't realize, is Moynihan was a general project plan. It was the model for a lot of what Holly's discussing in terms of the financing. Vornado's development and ownership of the adjacent office and retail space within Moynihan was bonded by the state and contributed about a third of the cost of actually building the train hall. Next slide. We continue to be in the public-private partnership business, working with the MTA and JANO. This is an entrance at 33rd and 7th that opened one day after Moynihan about a year ago. This piece of infrastructure doubled the number of escalators on the 7th Avenue side of the Long Island Railroad Concourse. This project sits partially on land that Vornado owns, and this was something that we managed on behalf of the MTA. Next slide. The Long Island Railroad Concourse, which sits underneath 33rd Street, was and remains the busiest concourse of all of Penn Station because it connects the 123 subways with the ACE subways with Moynihan underneath 8th Avenue. It has always been the busiest concourse along Penn Station. The image in the upper left shows you what it used to look like with a barrel vaulted ceiling. The entire north side of that concourse was retail owned by Vornado. That's where the Shake Shack, the Starbucks, the Duane Reade were for those that used to commute through here. We formed a partnership with the MTA about a year ago, where we're moving all of our stores 30 feet deeper into the basements of One Penn Plaza, taking this concourse from 30 feet wide to 60 feet wide, completely rebuilding both the ceiling above, which is the roadbed of 33rd Street, and all the finishes, mechanical systems, life safety systems in this concourse. The end result is a 60-foot wide corridor with 18-foot ceilings from end to end, and all new retail being delivered. Next slide. Throughout the district, Vornado has also been investing in our buildings with a focus on public realm improvements to the plazas that surround them, and looking for opportunities to include new entrances to Penn Stations through the existing buildings already in our portfolio. This is mid-block on 34th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue, formerly known as One Penn Plaza, which we've rebranded as Penn 1. On the right-hand side of the rendering, you'll see a new entrance is going in mid-block between 34th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue that will connect directly down into that Long Island Railroad Concourse currently under construction. This entrance will open in the next probably 3 to 6 months, and the Long Island Railroad Concourse is anticipated to be finished towards the end of this year. Next slide. This is an image of the inside of that building, which I invite you guys to go see what we're doing to try to change the character of the existing office stock in the neighborhood, make it more modern and open and inviting, not only to our tenants, but the community as a whole. The spaces are filled with restaurants, food outlets, casual seating, soft seating, and it's a pretty transformative project that I invite you to go visit. Next slide. On 7th Avenue between 31st and 33rd Street is 2 Penn Plaza, which we've rebranded as Penn 2. This is the building that you walk through to get in and out of Madison Square Garden. It has at its front at 32nd Street what we call the Amtrak entrance to Penn Station, which is one of the busiest entrances to Penn Station. Our project here includes a massive renovation, which includes a complete replacement of the curtain wall with a triple pane, very energy performing facade, and an expansion of the building out to reestablish the street wall on 7th Avenue and create a roof over the plaza space that serves as the entry to our building, Madison Square Garden, and Penn Station. Next slide. You can see the new entrance at 33rd and 7th in the lower right, sitting in a plaza, which was known as Plaza 33. This was a project that Mark Ricks on the screen actually piloted with us about a half dozen years ago, working with Community Board 5 and New York City DOT. Upon completion of the Long Island Railroad Concourse project at the end of this year, beginning of next year, this will be the first piece of that shared street that Holly presented to you along 33rd Street at 7th Avenue. Next slide. Just like at Penn 1, we're looking for opportunities at Penn 2 to try to improve the entry sequence into Penn Station. On the upper left is an image of what that entrance at 32nd Street and 7th Avenue looked like before. Vornado has given up its retail stores at that entrance to make the entrance wider. Working with Amtrak, we're adding a third escalator and for the first time an ADA elevator to this entrance at 32nd Street. This will deliver alongside the building in 2023. Next slide. And if you've been to 7th Avenue in the last several months, you'll see it's a giant construction site. All of this is actually happening. We're in the process of building both our buildings and all these public realm and transit improvements. All this is actually underway. This is not discussions. There's lots of work going and lots of men and women of the construction trades working tirelessly and through COVID to deliver all this for us and for the commuters and for the community as a whole. Next slide. As I mentioned, we're currently working with DOT and with the Design Commission on a final design for Plaza 33, so that when that construction that you saw on the last slide is finished towards the end of this year, we'll create a plaza at 7th Avenue along 33rd Street similar in size to the new plaza at One Vanderbilt next to Grand Central, which will provide trees, seating, benches, places for people to have lunch during the day or meet coworkers or colleagues or people going in and out of Madison Square Garden at the end of the day before getting on and off a train. Next slide. And with that, I think I'm done. And now it's time for Laura to take back over, right?
It certainly is. It's time to go to the Q&A portion. Thank you both for that really comprehensive presentation about what's in the GPP and what we currently see at street level around the Penn district. We had a few folks from our membership indicate that they had questions for the team. So I will start with Andrew Kennedy from Ostroff Associates. John, on our team, if we could unmute Andrew so that he can ask his question, that would be great.
Yeah. Hey, morning, everyone. It's Andrew Kennedy. Hope everyone is well. Holly, I have a question for you and Phil. After the GPP is approved by the ESTC board in the spring of 2022, what's the timing for the completion of that further environmental review? And then what are the steps that I think you would need to undertake to proceed with the development of the sites to the north and the east, and then when do we anticipate the NEPA process completed regarding the southern sites?
All good questions. So we're gonna, this is a little bit of a moving target because the Fed really kind of control that NEPA process and the process that the railroads have to go through, but we anticipate that the MTA, which is going to be the lead on the lead agency for the expansion NEPA, that will start probably in the summer. Maybe some overlap with us, maybe not, just depending. It does, there's not a connection there per se, since it's a separate project, and ours is just contingent on that. So we expect NEPA to take about 2 years. And then within that time, possibly at the end of it, possibly a little before the end of it, again, that's going to be determined by FTA and FRA. They may start being able to do some of the acquisition of the southern blocks if that's where the alternatives analysis lands. But conservatively, that probably doesn't start for 2 years until the NEPA approval process. So then you've got, a year to two on the acquisition, the relocation, the demolition. And it is highly unlikely that ESD would do the acquisition and condemnation. It makes a lot more sense for a lot of reasons for one of the railroads to do that. So most likely those blocks would be acquired by either Amtrak or MTA. And then ultimately at that point, we would come back in though to be part of the redevelopment of those sites. So we would end up owning the site, doing RFPs for developers to work with the railroads and with ESD on the overbuild. Obviously that would have to be well coordinated. So that would be our role, but we are very unlikely to be involved in the actual acquisition and condemnation. Phil, do you have anything you want to add to that? Or anyone else on our team? That it's not fully precise, but there's obviously some time before any of the actions on the southern blocks would be moving forward. Now, upon approval, Vornado could begin development of their sites, so those obviously would be front-ended.
Okay, and then does Amtrak and the MTA follow the same? Would they be allowed to go through the acquisition? A fast track acquisition like ESD can go through a GPP, or would have to follow the traditional New York City real estate process?
MTA and Amtrak have less process that in terms of that than we do.
Okay.
So they do not have to do a general project plan for transportation projects that either of them do. They have a different process, but they have to go through environmental review and public process, but it is not the same as our process.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks, Holly, for that comprehensive response. We next have a member of our Young Professional Steering Committee, Safina Maguire from Cravath. Safina.
Hi, good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for that presentation. My question is specific to the neighbors of the project. I live on 37th and 10th. So I'm very excited for the project plan and all it will do for the neighborhood. But I'm wondering if you could talk more specifically about how you anticipate the plan as it unfolds to affect residents of the neighborhood, how residents can continue to get involved with the project as it unfolds, and most importantly, how you think the project will encourage more of a neighborhood feel in this area, sort of Penn Station adjacent. And thank you again for your time.
Thanks. I'm glad you're excited. Feel free to come to our hearing and be a resident that's excited about this project. So, we agree, and I think Barry would second this too. We agree that this is going to be great for the neighborhood, having a mix of uses that complement the neighborhood and both not just commercial, not just residential, but to be really mixed use and to add to the public realm with new open space as well. I'm going to turn it over to Marion for a second just to talk about how we interact during construction of a project. We are very closely coordinated during construction with neighbors and have sort of a liaison assigned to the neighborhood to work through that. So we're very cognizant of that. We'll also have construction mitigation that's baked into our environmental review process that help mitigate a lot of the negative impacts of construction from, air quality, noise pollution, things like that. So those are really important pieces as well. And then, as I mentioned, Gabriella Green on our team will be launching the Public Realm Task Force, and that will work really closely with the community on what are the priorities, to put together a concept plan on what are the priorities for the public realm. We want to make sure those benefits that are really the ones that will be maybe most closely and immediately felt by the surrounding community, that those get front-ended and that we're making decisions on how public realm funding is spent really hand in glove with the community. I don't know, Marion or Angel, do you guys want to talk a little bit about our process with construction liaisons? Marion is there. Angel, do you want to talk about that for a minute?
They may be having a hard time unmuting.
Oh, okay. Maybe that's all right. So I can give the 2 seconds on that, which is really anytime we do a project, we have a person assigned to be that liaison for the community affairs group that Marion leads. We have ongoing public quality of life public meetings so that people can air any issues that are happening. And it's a very close ongoing relationship throughout completion, even of long-term projects. We are still very actively involved, for example, with the Atlantic Yards project, very actively involved with the community there. And that's, I don't know, we're in our second decade of that project. So we don't just walk away after we finish approvals of a project.
And Angel, I see you're now unmuted. I'm not sure if you just wanted to add anything there.
No, I think Holly hit it right on the nail. We are very much involved in, again, throughout the construction process in terms of sending out emails so the community knows what's going on, the next steps in whatever construction is happening. And we have folks who go out. Again, the quality of life individual will go out. If there's a noise complaint, we'll go out. We'll send folks at any time just to hear, to see what the noise level is. We'll work with the contractors. We'll do whatever we can to mitigate any concerns that the community may have.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Safina, for that question. Really appreciate the community lens on things. I think, many of the folks here in our membership have noticed that we've been really conscious of the community engagement process, throughout GPPs and ULURPs and the development of our city. So we appreciate you bringing that into this conversation. I saw George Calderaro had his hand raised. So George, I'd love to give you the floor to ask your question of the panel.
Great. Thank you very much. George Calderaro, I'm a board member of the 29th Street Neighborhood Association. So we're directly affected by this proposal. And ESD can talk about community meetings, but if you don't listen to what's said by our association as well as Community Board 4 and 5, what's the point? My broad question is really about a better New York. How can destruction of 9 blocks of viable midtown buildings and housing thousands of businesses, residents, and workers, as well as demolishing dozens of, again, viable, historic, National Register and New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission eligible buildings be described as creating a better New York? We all hate Penn Station, and you're dangling that as a red herring to sell this project. But as Mr. Langer convincingly said, this work is already taking place. And as Jano Lieber, the head of the MTA, said, we don't need this money, which is completely speculative, as Ms. Leicht said.
George, thank you so much for your opinion. I'll just, kind of pause.
It's not just my opinion, Laura.
I am aware there are several different groups here or groups represented not only on this phone call, but throughout the city who have many opinions about what should occur in this district. And so what we're trying to do in this forum is really understand what's included in the GPP and also how the developer is actually working with the community to take that feedback to inform their plans as well. So I think, this is what we need to do.
I'm happy to comment a little bit on that. I mean, obviously, nobody blithely takes historic resources. I started my career working at National Trust for Historic Preservation. I am a very deep-seated preservationist. Looking at those southern blocks, where there would be demolition of some historic resources is not something anyone's taking on lightly. We're studying that. As part of this, that will get studied again in the NEPA. If there was a way to not have to demolish those blocks to expand Penn, that would certainly be considered and is being considered. There has been a lot of discussion about through running. The engineering suggests that through running is not feasible, but that'll get studied, from within an inch of its life in the NEPA. Our process is not looking at the engineering of the train project, but look, I hear you on those southern blocks, and that is something that's going to get studied. But to expand Penn Station will likely require, because of how shallow the tracks are, to integrate existing Penn with a new Penn Station that likely will be to the south, but again studied, requires that demolition. It is not being done, because of overdevelopment. That is not the overbuild is not the reason why that would be done. It would be done to expand Penn Station. So I just want to be clear that that is why those 3 southern blocks are contingent on the expansion of Penn. It would not otherwise, those would not otherwise get redeveloped. As in terms, and I'll let Barry speak about the 5 sites they own, but many of those, there's 2 of those sites that have single-story taxpayers on them. This is a very underutilized area for the transit hub, the busiest transit hub in the Northern Hemisphere. So I don't know, Barry, if you want to talk to your sites at all.
Sure. I mean, as Holly said, 2 of the sites are single-story taxpayers. It's a beloved Duane Reade on 8th Avenue and Bank of America branch on 7th Avenue. The other corner is a H&M store, which is now Forever 21. So 3 of the sites are Lowe's-Rise sites. And I also point out that 2 of the sites, Site 4, which is the corner of 34th and 8th, and the Hotel Pennsylvania, which is Site 7, have previously been entitled through both the Moynihan General Project Plan and through a city ULURP action in 2010. So the idea of redeveloping these sites on the north is not new. It's been something that's been studied and in fact acted upon in the past through city processes and state processes.
Thank you both. And thank you. I think there's a lot of confusion among the public, or at least, the feedback that we've heard from our members about what's included in the GPP, what isn't. And so you kind of explained that the Penn South process follows this. But there's a lot of talk about the surrounding areas, Herald Square, Greeley Square, what's happening with Madison Square Garden, what's the tie-in with the Gateway program. What are sort of the top lines that you can give to us today so that we can understand and share that information, with our colleagues so that we're really providing the actual facts of this project?
So Madison Square Garden is really not impacted by the GPP. That is going to be studied and is really connected to the renovation of Penn and the expansion of Penn. There's nothing in the GPP that precludes any future action on MSG. If at some point in the future MSG does relocate, there's nothing that would preclude that from happening in what we're doing. It's really sort of outside of the scope of our piece of this project. With respect to Herald and Greeley Square, the subway stations are the improvements that I described do extend to Herald and Greeley Square stations. The at-grade portion, one of the things, while we have very defined boundaries for the development plan, when we launched this public realm task force, they can look at areas that are proximate to, including Herald and Greeley Square. So city planning has very much put that, and DOT has prioritized those. There were some improvements to those that are part of the Macy's project that plans to go forward as a ULURP. But when Gabriella's committee is looking to make a concept plan about public realm improvements, those do not have to be just within the same boundaries as our GPP development plan. So we do anticipate that those will get discussed within the public realm task force. It's not off limits that there could be some improvements over there, but I think we want to let that process play out to really prioritize where do we think we get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of creating public realm improvements. But there's nothing about our boundaries that would preclude looking at Greeley and Herald Square from a public realm improvement perspective. Does that answer your question, Laura, for those two? I don't know if there's any other. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful because, we're taking this site in the context of the surrounding area as well. So it's helpful to know how this all ties in.
No, and I would just add that the Moynihan Pipeline Connector project that I think you mentioned earlier, part of why we launched that was, again, this recognition that on a public realm perspective, the impacts go beyond just our project boundaries. And so that's a way for us to further connect people westward that are coming into Penn, particularly with the expansion. So we are looking at this kind of with the idea of connectivity to the east and west, even though our development focus is really just within those 8 sites.
Thank you for that. And I'll just give one final plug for any last questions. I see we have about 5 minutes left, so perhaps we can fit 1 or 2 more in. I'll hit on another one. Looking to different projects that have occurred around the city that might serve as a model for, either the public engagement process for this GPP or perhaps even financing models. We think about East Midtown. Have we learned lessons from other major projects that we're applying here? And really, what are those? And how can we set forward, some of the lessons that we learned to make this a more positive process?
I'll let others jump in on this. I think that the process that we did with both our original community advisory committee and then with the expanded working group has been a really useful process that has greatly improved this project. I think all of us involved would agree with that. we are very open to figuring out ways to work with the community. And I think, that will continue with the railroads as they go through their NEPA. So this is a big project, and there's no question about it. No one is going to say that this isn't, and that there aren't going to be major impacts. But it's also one of the most important projects New York City can take on in the next generation. And so does that mean that there are going to be some hard choices, particularly with respect to expanding Penn Station? Yes, there will be. But I think this isn't an either or. I mean, I think it is to say, oh, we want Penn Station, but that's all we want. That is just not realistic from a financing perspective or just from a physical space perspective. It's a very limited footprint, the existing Penn, and we have to look beyond that. So I think we want to continue engaging with people. We want to try to quell misinformation, and there's a lot of misinformation. I am happy always, as my team knows, to have dialogues with people who disagree with this, who have concerns. We all have concerns, but I think the more that we can do what you're trying to do, Laura, and get actual facts out there, and maybe we'll disagree on what to do with those facts, but I think that one of the most important things is to try to just get real information out there as much as possible. And we have put a ton of stuff on our website. Everything that was discussed in our working group is on our website. All the presentations that were made, the minutes from those meetings. So if you are a glutton for punishment and want to dig into all of that, it's all on the ESG website. And I think what you will see if you go in there is really, really ardent discussion. And we're not looking to hide anything. It's a big project, and there will be impacts, but we think that this is one of the most important things that Governor Hochul and her team can lead forward.
Thank you for that. I have one last question that I hope to fit in before we wrap here. And I just want to go back to the projection about 50,000 construction jobs coming to the Penn District as a result of this project. One of the things that we've been focused on at the ABNY Foundation is working with workforce development partners who are actually on the ground providing services. And so I wonder if there's been engagement or thought to working with local groups to make sure that those 50,000 construction jobs stay local, perhaps have specific goals with labor or MWBE components. If you could just speak to that for a moment, that would be terrific.
Sure, and I'm going to kick it in a second to Barry, since his construction is probably the first that will go forward. But we will have MWBE goals that apply to all 8 sites, including the private sites. The 30% goal that the state embraces. So that is there, and we have committed that when we get to the public construction elements, we will certainly work toward local hiring. It's just a little premature right now before we have the public project to make those commitments. But Barry, do you want to talk a little bit to the commitments we've discussed for your site?
Sure. I mean, the first thing I'd say is, in building Moynihan, which was both the train hall and the private space, we successfully, with our partners at Skanska, had a very high goal for MWBE participation, which we met on that project that we and Skanska are very proud of having achieved. Specifically to our sites, Vornado is a member of REBNY. REBNY and the Building Trades Council have a very solid agreement that provides for a labor participation in all of our projects. To date, all the buildings that we've been working on, the existing buildings in Penn 1 and Penn 2, the workforce has been extraordinary working through COVID day and night, which I mentioned earlier, but I think is worth mentioning again. While a lot of us were quarantining at home, the men and women of labor were out building Moynihan, building the 33rd Street entrance, and building our projects. And so I always take a chance to commend them for that work. So the options for going forward in the new buildings will include MWBE requirements, as Holly mentioned, and a robust labor participation that will model after the agreements between REBNY and the Building Trades Council.
Terrific. Thank you for that explanation. I appreciate it. I think we've come to the end of our time today. I want to thank Holly, Barry, Phil, your colleagues at ESD and Vornado for joining us today and providing this briefing. I encourage everybody to really visit the ESD website and educate yourselves on the GPP. I know we have, or there is a hearing coming up on January 20th, so we'll all be watching the news to see how that turns out. But again, thank you all for joining the first ABNY meeting of 2022 on this very important topic. I appreciate all of your questions, and we'll hope to see you all soon. Thank you, Holly, Barry, and Phil again.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.